Hello. Today we're going to talk about the Battle of the Atlantic. Now, the Battle of the Atlantic is one of the issues that spans almost the entire war. In a sense, it's quite comparable to questions about Churchill or questions about the army in that sense. And so, in some respects, it can be quite a difficult question to deal with. It can be quite a difficult question to answer. But one of the advantages of the extent that it lasts means that it can be used in lots of different other areas. There are parts of it, again, that you can take away and add elsewhere. So, for example, you can use the prioritization of different technologies in Churchill essays and argue that perhaps Churchill should have done more to win the Battle of the Atlantic earlier. You can also talk about the technological failings or the lack of technological development at the start of the war and the preparations for war essay. You can also talk about the extent to which Britain needed supplies as an aspect of economic essays and how they needed these Atlantic supplies to come in order to feed and supply the nation. So while the Battle of the Atlantic is quite a hard topic in the sense that you do have to know quite a lot of information, it can be quite a good one because you can also use it in lots of different areas, as I've already mentioned about quite a few other of the essays that we have looked at. So, as you can see, that we are now moving on to the Battle of the Atlantic. We looked at the Battle of the Britain with um, earlier on, and we're going to look at the Bomber Command in the Army and future lessons as well. So you can see that that will be us kind of dealt with the military and naval and air strategies. And obviously note that as this is a topic in italics, it can come up as a source question or as a essay question. However, as we can see, all of these are in red. You tend not to get source questions about this. A specific source question, it wouldn't be out with the bounds of possibility. I wouldn't die of shock if they gave you a source question just on the Battle of the Atlantic specifically, but they do tend to more focus on essay questions for this because it does tend to set itself up more as an essay question. And essay questions for this, the advantage of them are that they're always the same. They are asking you, why did the Allies win the Battle of the Atlantic? They will use different isolated factors, so you have to focus the question slightly differently sometimes, but you can basically learn an essay for this one where you can just move the paragraphs around slightly, perhaps, if the isolated factor is a bit different. So the ones that have been recently, you can see they're kind of every 2 years, and then a bit before that for the 2010 one, that aircraft are the great menace for submarines, so that's aircraft as the isolated factor, the Enigma code as the isolated factor, technological developments as the isolated factor, and in 2010 it was just what factors explain the victory. So those questions, as you can see, they're all asking the same thing, and in many ways that's good. There isn't really any nuance or any complexity they can add. The only thing that was perhaps quite difficult about the 2018 question was that aircraft can fall under the technological development part. So that one was asking about aircraft specifically. So sometimes I think for some people they would have revised more the technological developments, and as part of that had maybe a point or two about aircraft, and so they had to do an entire paragraph about aircraft, which was a bit of a challenge. But you can focus on that, and I think aircraft are the only aspect of technology that they can identify and isolate. They wouldn't be able to ask a question specifically about developments on depth charges or developments in lighting technology or developments in direction finding technology, any of those sort of things. So having a good few points of knowledge about aircraft as part of a technological development section is going to really help you. Okay, so in terms of introducing this topic, the first thing you need to do, perhaps differently to some other questions, you really need to set this in context. You need to make sure you define what the Battle of the Atlantic was and why it was so important to the British war effort. So you have to be able to basically explain that the Battle of the Atlantic involves the Germans trying to starve the British and surrender by sinking the merchant ships that were heading to Britain from North America, and the battle is the Allies trying to develop countermeasures to either avoid and evade the convoys or directly to target and sink the U-boats. And that is the battle. It's were the U-boats able to sink enough ships, or were the ships able to get through and the British were able to sink, and the British and the Americans and the Canadians able to sink enough U-boats. So that's the sort of thing you have to explain. What would you mean by Battle of the Atlantic? Why is it important? And then obviously in your introduction you have to go and explain the different factors that led to the Allied victory. So you're basically going to answer the question, which one was it? And say that, you know, it's a bit of this, a bit of this, a bit of this, and but it's mainly this, or you can say it's a bit of this, a bit of this, and a bit of this, and it's all of them together. Also, important to note that Churchill famously stated, the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril, which is a really interesting quote, because there are some people that would argue actually Churchill didn't really focus enough on the U-boat threat during the war, and so you can bring that into Churchill essays, and you can also talk a little bit about that in this essay. Okay, as I said, there's quite a lot of information to know about this particular topic, and so we have to have a grasp of the key terms, and I put a document in this essay folder that's got a bit more of the kind of key terms and a little bit more detail about them, but I think there are a few that I really want to go over just to make sure that you're really clear in your heads about what these key terms are. So first one is ship types, and there are lots of different ship types to think about, but generally speaking you have to understand two, and those are the U-boats. The U-boats that the German submarines used to attack Allied shipping. Basically, they spent most of their time on the surface. They needed to be on the surface to recharge their batteries and to sail most places. That's where they were most efficient. And then when they sighted Allied shipping, or when they sighted aircraft, they would dive and they would run on battery power, and they would attack or they would evade the ships that were trying to find and sink them. So U-boats are the main German weapon in this battle. And then destroyers are the main Allied weapon, and they are small warships which are used to hunt and U-boats and also to protect the convoys. Obviously, the British at the start of the war had a serious lack of destroyers, which is why I had the Destroyers for Bases agreement, which is where the British exchanged bases in the Caribbean for 50 World War I era destroyers, and this again leads into preparation for war and economic things. You can bring that and talk a little bit about that in different areas. So destroyers are the main kind of weapon of the Allies. So it's basically, in terms of the naval warfare, destroyers versus U-boats. Obviously the Allies are able to bring in aircraft and the Germans are able to bring in aircraft as well. But when we're talking about the actual sea battle, these are the two main things. In terms of tactics used, so convoys are just large groups of ships. So at the very beginning of the war, the merchant ships would sail across the Atlantic by themselves, but that obviously became very difficult to protect. So large groups of ships would all form up in the Atlantic ports in North America or the ports in Britain before they sailed across the Atlantic, and they would set out in a large group protected on the outside and in various places, strategic places, by the destroyers. So this was obviously meant it was a lot easier to protect, a lot more effective, and convoys were massively important in terms of allowing the Allies to win. And then we had convoy support groups, also known as hunter-killer groups, and these are groups of anti-submarine warships, usually destroyers again, that whose job was to specifically hunt down and sink U-boats, and these would be deployed throughout the Atlantic. And when they were, it was heard that a certain Allied convoy was being attacked, the hunter-killer group, if it was close enough, would automatically head towards there, and rather than protecting the convoy, their job was to sink the U-boats. And that kind of step onto the offensive rather than being on the defensive was very important. And that's a very big technological, tactical advance that was developed by, as we said, a guy called Max Horton, who was an admiral in the Navy, and he's a very important figure and someone that you can talk about, and how his kind of tactical innovations with these convoy support groups were very important in victory. And then technology, obviously a huge range of technology developed. I think there are a couple in particular that are worth definitely knowing about. HFDF, sometimes called HFDUF, high frequency direction finding, is a technology that could be used to find where radio signals are coming from. So when the U-boats would broadcast their weather reports or their battle reports back to their bases, the Allies would be able to detect where these broadcasts were originating from, and then use that to basically work out where the U-boats were positioned in the Atlantic, and then either sail or fly to that position and attempt to destroy the U-boats. Now, this is exceptionally important because the Atlantic is very big, and if you're just sailing around randomly, it's quite unlikely that you're going to come across a U-boat. But if you're able to locate a pretty good area as to where they are, that's going to massively help your chances. And then depth charges. Now, depth charges are the main weapon that destroyers used against U-boats. They were pushed off the side. They were basically canisters filled with explosives. They would fall to a certain depth, and then they would be at a certain depth. They would explode, and the explosion would ripple through the water and would hopefully destroy the U-boat. Throughout the war, the aircraft were able to launch depth charges, which was obviously a lot more effective in terms of being able to move quickly. And later in the war, from 1942 onwards, there was a new weapon, not technically a depth charge, called the Hedgehog, but similar sort of principle. They were a mortar system that could be fired both in front and behind a ship to target U-boats, and these things would explode on contact with a solid object. So whenever they touched the hull of a U-boat, they would blow up, and they were very effective in destroying U-boats. Okay, so that's the general idea and the kind of key terms. Now we're going to look at the specific paragraphs. Now, as I said, the Battle of Atlantic is a very long conflict. Pretty much starts on the outset of the war and finishes at the end. The U-boats were in the Atlantic the Germans were attacking Allied shipping basically for the entire war. But there's a main period from around about 1941 to around about 1944 where the U-boat attack are at their height, and it's in this period that we see the Allies kind of in trouble and perhaps beginning to lose the Battle of Atlantic, and then things turn around and they really start to win. So to understand, to explain how this happened, I'd separate the kind of factors into 4 key headings. So the Enigma Code, first of all, which is that the British and Allies and Polish and various other people were involved in breaking the German code, and this gave them access to a huge amount of German information. And by using this, they were able to locate U-boat packs in the Atlantic and send convoys around about them, or send specific hunter-killer groups to locate the U-boat packs. Now, the Germans thought that the Enigma Code was unbreakable, and so they were willing to share a huge amount of very important information that way. And the Enigma Code is hugely important in terms of the victory. And then we've got technology, as I've already kind of mentioned. Aircraft, weapons, location systems, and radio all mean that the Allies are able to avoid U-boats or sink them, basically. As I said, that one of the essay questions did ask the aircraft thing to be separated out, and so you could add a paragraph on aircraft and then a paragraph about the weapons, location systems, and radio itself. So that's an important thing to consider, that you could be asked that in the exam. So be aware of that, but make sure that when you're talking about those sort of things, you're talking about how the developments in technology were able to allow the Allies to actually either avoid U-boats or to actively sink them, and that was important in terms of their victory. Then we have Allied navies and tactics. So the convoy system, the convoy support system, obviously protects merchant shipping and helps the Allies sink U-boats. There's also the importance of the growth of the Canadian Navy. By the end of the war, the Canadian Navy is massive. They have hugely contributed to the defence of convoys and the attacking of U-boats in the Atlantic. And the Americans committed significantly to the Liberty Ship program, which was the ships that were built very, very quickly. Merchant ships that could be built in a couple of hundred days, and thousands of them were built during the war. And this ability of the Americans to ramp up production massively is also hugely important, because the more ships you can build, that means that the more ships the Germans have to sink in order to win this tonnage war, this idea that the Germans need to sink more ships than are getting across. And if you're building more and more and more ships, and the Germans are only able to sink a very small number of them, that means that your victory is going to become bigger and bigger as time goes on. And finally, German mistakes. As with quite a lot of the military campaigns that we've looked at, that human error is an important, very important part of it. And so at the start of the war, the Germans are perhaps too focused on large surface ships. They want to kind of go toe to toe with the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy has a large number of large surface ships, Prince of Wales, Hood, and various other ones. And so they think that the way to achieve naval dominance is to kind of try and replicate things that the Royal Navy has done. However, if they had focused on U-boat production, it's possible that they would have had much more success in the Atlantic. It's also important to note that Hitler in 1941 begins to move large numbers of the U-boat fleet into the Mediterranean to attack British shipping that is protecting Malta and the Western Desert campaign. So that begins to have cause problems for the British in the Mediterranean, but it gives the British and Allied shipping in the Atlantic a huge amount of respite, and is able to kind of recover and bring a lot of shipping across. So those are the four kind of sections I would look at, and you can prioritize there, or you can maybe move some of the things around, but generally speaking, these are the key things you want to talk about. As always, historiography plays a really important part. There's a list of seven, yep, factors there that you can kind of get your head around. Remember, you don't have to directly quote them. I've maybe quoted one or two of them there, but as long as you get the general idea that, you know, over saying it's an overall victory, that Max Hastings talks about the American shipbuilding and the A.G.P. Taylor, again, the combination of factors. And so having an understanding of the general thrust, just how they would answer that question, you know, Max Hastings would say that it's a combination, but shipbuilding is really particularly important. Having an understanding of that is really important. And as always, primary sources are really good. I tried to find a copy of Karl Donitz's book about the Battle of the, well, his memoirs of the war, but I couldn't find a version of it that I could share with you. So I've just taken one of his quotes that's quite good, that when he's talking at the start of the war, he says, "Conditions were also almost exactly those of normal peacetime. Very few anti-submarine measures appeared to have been introduced. There were admittedly anti-submarine patrols, but they were wholly lacking in experience." Basically, the preparations were poor, and the Allies, and the British in particular, weren't really ready for the war. So that tells us a little bit about how much technological developments and tactic changes helped, because you can say, look, it's really bad at the start, as demonstrated by this quote, but obviously things got better. And then we've got the Churchill quote we've already mentioned about, it's the only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. But the thing that's important about the Donitz quote is that this can be used in lots of different areas. You can use it for preparations for war. You could bring it into a Chamberlain essay to say, like, this Chamberlain wasn't really understanding the problems. You can bring it into this essay, so it's got a lot of weight and a lot of usefulness. As I said, I couldn't find any kind of particularly useful primary sources for this specific one. There was lots of articles and things like that, but I thought, instead of just constantly going back and reading some primary sources, I thought this time, for a change, we would have a look at a dissertation. So I've done that. I've put a dissertation in the folder for you to have a look at. As ever, if you have any questions about any of this, just send me a message and I will do my best to answer them. Hopefully that was reasonably straightforward and quite helpful.